So while discussing bodies and reading bodies and how societies and cultures quite often use bodies to create a narrative or further a narrative, for further an ideology even, um, I guess it's probably important for us to move that forward to today and look at what is going on in our cultures and societies today, and maybe even narrowing it down even further. What do you see are some of the problems that we see in the church with the way that the church reads bodies, the bodies of males and females and maybe foreigners? Um, yeah.
Mm. I mean, I think that's where my interest lies, and why I pursued the question of what is the relationship between Paul as an embodied male, Jewish male, writing a body of texts that we as the church have taken up as authoritative and in many ways as determinative for how we ought to understand God. So our theology, but also our understanding of the church and of how the church should be structured. So my interest there is that as a body of texts that we view as carrying authority, we have to recognize that we in the church employ those texts to shape and to re-socialize the individuals of those in our communities today. That's the purpose of the text, right? That we believe that this text somehow has something to say to us about how we should live our lives. And so I think we do need to wrestle with what we do with the text and how we use it as a means to shaping identity, and what kinds of identities are being shaped as a consequence of our approach to that text. So in that sort of way of thinking, I want to draw attention to how we use the biblical text to construct the idea about what it means to be male and what it means to be female. And I'm asking questions immediately: which texts do we use in answering the question, what does it mean to be a biblical male and a biblical female? I'm also asking the question, is there something missing if the answer to the question assumes that there's only one way of being male and one way of being female? What is the assumption, the underlying assumption in my approach to the biblical text at that point? So if I analyze a lot of what has been produced by those who are very strong advocates for a biblical womanhood, biblical manhood, there's an overwhelming sense in which there's a univocal message that the Bible has on what it means to be male and female, and it doesn't entertain the possibility that the biblical text itself reflects diversity in relation to the answer to that question of what it means to be male and female. It also doesn't reflect very critically on the importance of asking whether or not an ancient text should be given the kind of authority at the level of cultural norm in relation to the question of what it means to be male and female. And until such time as we actually wrestle with those questions, I think we're in danger of simply perpetuating a very narrow, very anemic understanding of human identity, which often comes down to very culturally normed understandings, that we have somehow bought into the idea that these things are now normative for all time. And I think that's where the challenge is.
Yeah. So, and do you see there being a toxic masculinity that's being pushed by the church, that is accepted in society, or pushed on society and accepted by the church?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one that we have to deal with quite carefully. I would say that when we talk about toxic masculinity, we need to understand that it is first and foremost referring to an expression of masculinity that holds to the idea that there's in a sense a singular understanding of what it means to be male. It has a lot to do with particular characteristics that we've accepted as norm for what it means to be male. So in typical ways, we would talk about men as being rational and strong and risk takers and any number of the characteristics that any one of us could list off the top of our heads. And what happens is that those characteristics become the norm by which all masculinity is defined and therefore judged. It becomes toxic when the assertion of that expression of masculinity doesn't allow for any other possibilities of expression. And it becomes toxic in the context of pushing for a patriarchal, which is to say, a male-dominated understanding of how society should be structured, and as a consequence, assuming that the role of women should be submissive or submissive to men, and that is the natural norm for society. The problem is then it gets baptized, right? So that thinking gets a layer of theologizing added to it that makes it even more toxic, in my opinion. And here we also need to just step back for a second and deal with the fact that the biblical text itself is a text that is produced within culture at a particular moment in time, or several, over an extended period of time. And because patriarchy is such a norm at the time of the writing of the New Testament, we have to deal with the fact that the writers of the New Testament in a patriarchal culture are influenced and shaped by that patriarchal culture. Yes, there are examples within the text where they try to move against that patriarchy or they try to subvert that patriarchy. But at the end of the day, the text itself is produced within a patriarchal culture. And as a patriarchal text, therefore, I have to deal with the fact that the text gets used in the context of the church to reinforce patriarchal thinking or hierarchical thinking, and then becomes, because of our view of Scripture as being divinely inspired and therefore authoritative, that the patriarchal norms in the text are seen as divinely authorized and normative for the community of faith. At that point, you can then understand why we have a situation where women are not allowed to be priests or ministers or preachers, where the roles of women are circumscribed, and that there are very strict hierarchies that need to be maintained as a consequence. But you can also then see it's not just men in relation to women, it becomes men or a particular version of masculinity in relation to all other expressions of masculinity that don't conform to that norm.
Yeah, and I guess I'm curious to know is it just a rereading of Scripture that will help us get out of this rut that we're in? Seeing multiple understandings of Scripture will help us see multiple understandings of masculinity and femininity, and some variances within the understandings of gender, or is it something else? Does something else have to happen? Because it seems like we're kind of in the patriarchal understanding within the church is very much tied and in a happy wedlock, happy union with society, at least in the US. So what is something that you think that we could do that that would remedy the situation? And what would a remedied situation look like?
I think there's a lot of work that we have to do. I think a lot of that work begins with what it is that we're working with when we work with the biblical text. I mean, answering that question, I think, is of critical importance. I think we need to challenge the understanding that the biblical text we need to challenge the understanding that the biblical text isn't carrying a cultural norm embedded within it. And when we're able to at least acknowledge that, I think it opens us up to the possibility to ask some of the questions that we should be asking of the text. When a text prescribes certain things and presents those as normative, well, of course they're being presented as normative. They make absolute sense within the first century context in which they were written. But we have to ask ourselves the question, what in that prescription is essentially an attempt to carry over the culture? And what is it that is actually going on in Paul, for example, making that as the norm? I think that's the first thing that we need to wrestle with, is what is it that we're actually dealing with when we're working with the biblical text? How do we, in some ways, disentangle some of the cultural stuff that is embedded within the text? Not so that we strip it from the text, but that we acknowledge its presence in the text. I think the other thing is, as you rightly alluded to, we need to be reading the biblical text with people who are other than ourselves. Because one's social location plays into our reading of the biblical text. And that social location highlights certain things and therefore also hides certain things that are present in the text. That when I'm reading with people who are not like me, and as a white male, I need to read the biblical text with people who are not white and not male, it brings things to the surface that are in the text that are being noticed by those who are not like me, who don't have the same politics I have, who don't have the same class I have. So we can add any number of intersectionalities in this conversation, whether it's class, gender, religion, anything that plays into our construction of identity. If I'm reading with people who are only like me, who only view the world like I view the world, then I'm only going to ever see that play out within the text, because as Miguel de la Torre reminds us, is that when we read the biblical text, we read it to support our social location, right? And so wrestling with what is going on with this text that we're actually trying to make sense of, reading with people who are not like us, and wrestling with the complexities of colonial reality within the biblical text itself, and then asking ourselves the question, what is our vested interest in pursuing a particular line of interpretation? What does it say about our positionality as a consequence? And I think that's the hard work. That's where a lot of the work is. But I also suspect that is where a lot of the disruption is as well, and where the discomfort will be.